Hi folks, Zaki Hassan here. Welcome back to Nostalgia Theater. This is pretty exciting. We're into May now, and with summer movie season starting, I've got a lot of fun episodes planned to tie in with the stuff that you're going to be seeing in the movie theater. So between movie film and Nostalgia Theater, we've got plenty of fun conversations. So please do hit subscribe for the Nostalgia Theater show in iTunes if you haven't already. And with that, let's dive into the latest show. I think you're going to like it.
Zaki Hassan is your host on this most epic journey through pop culture's past. Hold on to your butts. This is Nostalgia Theater.
Brought to you by the Movie Film Podcast.
Hi everybody, welcome back to Nostalgia Theater. Now, as you know, we spend a lot of time on this show talking about artifacts from days past, primarily the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, which is kind of my era of growing up, but even before that. And we've spent a lot of time talking to people who were involved intimately in creating this stuff. But when it comes to Nostalgia Theater, where it's at these days, I realize that IDW Publishing, the comic book company, is where most of these properties have ended up and not just survived, but thrived and flourished. So on my list of people that I absolutely wanted to talk to when we started this show is Chris Ryall, who is the Chief Creative Officer and Editor-in-Chief of IDW. He's been there since 2004. He's also writer of the Eisner Award-nominated series Zombies vs. Robots, which he co-created with Ashley Wood. And IDW, for those of you who don't know, is the current home for such properties as Transformers, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Jem and the Holograms, G.I. Joe, Ghostbusters, Star Trek, at the X-Files. That's what I'm thinking off the top of my head. In the past, they've published 24, Angel, The A-Team, Castlevania, CSI. Chris, what am I missing?
For starters, well, there's Godzilla, there's Judge Dredd.
The list is just too long.
It is a long and worthwhile list, yeah.
Now, what I found is that a lot of times, when it comes to big comic book companies, there, at least when we're talking about Marvel and DC, there tends to be sort of the redheaded stepchild approach to licensed books. Those are the things that are kind of there in the corner, and they don't really focus on them, not to the same degree as the main titles. Especially lately, it seems like the big two have shied away from licensed books, whereas at IDW, this is a major portion of your output. This is like I said, you have made these books thrive. So what is it about licensed books that is you find such appeal in as far as being able to continue publishing them?
Well, the funny thing about it is I'm a kid that grew up reading Marvel and DC. So, I mean, I've been reading this stuff for pretty much my entire life. And a big portion of that was always the licensed stuff. So I was there at the early days of the Star Wars comics that Marvel put out, and they did a lot of movie tie-ins. Most of them were done in just a couple issues, but there was Indiana Jones, and there was He-Man on the DC side. There was any number of these things, and they were all almost to a one sort of shoddy. It was, and I get it. The Marvel and DC are there to service the brands and the trademarks and the characters that they own. So if you are a top writer and artist, you're going to be writing and drawing Spider-Man or X-Men or Fantastic Four or Superman. And so in those days when they would do a tie-in book or a licensed comic, it was always, whoever was available or maybe who was reliable or who, it wasn't necessarily your A-list talent. And so I not only grew up reading a lot of the stuff, so having a pretty strong sense of what worked and what didn't. But then when we really started delving into licensing back, really kind of coinciding with me joining IDW in 2004, it was a matter of, all right, well, let's be the place then. We don't own superhero brands, and we don't want to compete with Marvel and DC because they have 75 years of established history and prominence and dominance in those categories. So let's take the licensed books and give them the same kind of treatment, and let's put top creators and people who really love this stuff on these books and see if we can't, make licensed books as important to those fans as Spider-Man is to fans of superhero comics.
Well, and so based on the timeline, you started in '04. Preceding your tenure there was CSI, and
Yes.
I believe the Shield, if I'm not mistaken, was before you joined there.
Yeah, those had just started probably within 6 months of me joining, and that was the company's initial forays into licensed comics. Up to that point, they had only done a couple art books with Ashley Wood, and then some horror titles like 30 Days of Night with Steve Niles. So the company was primarily a horror publisher, and then dabbled in licensing with things like CSI that I think at the time nobody really even had any interest in doing that sort of thing as a comic, because
Yeah.
there wasn't a genre element to it. You know, Grissom didn't wear a costume, and there wasn't any super powered anything. So it didn't on the surface have that much appeal as a comic book, because comics, are largely genre based. So I think having Ashley Wood involved in that, where Ash's art was used as the flashback scenes.
That's right.
It was kind of funny. Like CSI really did help give birth to what IDW has become, in that, not only have we done licensed books in a much bigger way since then, but Ashley Wood is obviously a much larger part of IDW in the last decade. Gabriel Rodriguez, who got his start drawing CSI there, has become, one of our most beloved and family members on the art side. So that was kind of where it all got started. But it was really, the horror stuff was what people knew us from then. That's what really people bought a lot of and wanted more of. And so Transformers was the license. That was the comic that really changed the company into something far beyond what people thought of us, and started really getting people to pay attention to us in a way that they never had before.
So Transformers started, well, it was probably like '05, I think.
October of '05 was when we launched the Zero issue, yeah.
Wow, okay. So I just pulled that out of the air, so I'm kind of impressed with myself, actually.
Yeah.
Now, did you land the Transformers license because of the connection with Paramount through CSI, or what?
No, not at all. It was we basically saw that the Transformers brand was up for review. It had been out of market for 6 or 9 months after
Dreamwave, right?
Yeah, and so we got just reached out to Hasbro, said we would like to come pitch them. So we were pitching against, the big two, and we were pitching against Dark Horse, and we were up against well-established, well-known publishers who had a background in doing this kind of thing. So we were completely the unknown wild card of, Hasbro didn't know what we were. They didn't know what we did. They didn't know at all why we thought, why we would presume to think we could do Transformers comics in a way that they would want. And so it became a matter of really selling them on what we could do and why we would, be the right choice for them. And a lot of that boiled down to, like you say, us just putting our top creators we could find on the book and treating it as in the same way that Marvel and DC treat their brands. So this was going to not just be a title that we signed to do. It was going to become the most important thing that we did, and the thing that we put all our resources behind. And I think Hasbro saw that level of commitment we were willing to give this, and realized that we were going to do something special and really throw everything we could at this to make it work and reach that fan base and engage people the way they had hoped. And I'd say in the last 10, 11 years of doing that, and then growing our business far beyond, just Transformers with Hasbro, it's all gone very nicely according to plan, but far exceeding our initial plans anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I was just looking at your online storefront on my tablet, and I didn't realize just what a big footprint the Transformers imprint is for you guys. I mean, you have a substantial number of series, far beyond what I realized, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, we've done so many in the last 10 years, and that's been a thing that just overall, when we take on a license, that's another thing that licensors have really liked to see, in that they know they're not going to give us a license for a property and we're going to do a 4-issue miniseries and then sit on it for another year. When we signed to do Turtles, we look back after our first 12 months of Ninja Turtles, and we had, way more than a dozen comics out there. We had a couple different series. We had miniseries. We had trade paperback collections. We had high-end books. And so we're really good at putting out a lot of good product around these different properties in ways that the fans have really seemed engaged by and the licensors really appreciate. So again, like with Transformers, it was a thing where not only Hasbro, but the rest of the world had to kind of figure out who IDW was. And then they've seen that that we really do pride ourselves on the care that we give these properties when we take them on.
Now, when you started out with the Transformers license, you had a decision to make. And by the way, worth pointing out here, you started the Transformers before the movies did.
Yes.
You were ahead of the curve.
We knew there was movie talk, that even at the time in mid 2005 when we were pitching, there was talk, and it may have already been underway. The movie didn't come out till 2007, so
yeah.
We knew that, if we can get in here now before the movie really comes out in a big way, like we're going to be nicely positioned to not only have a lot of books out around the movie, but get in there before. Movies always change things. They change companies' expectations and they change the public's expectations. They change a lot of things. So getting in there and getting established as a comic series before the movie is always a better way to go.
Well, and as far as establishing yourself, I mean, you had a decision to make with how do you acknowledge the voluminous Transformers output that predated you? So there was the Dreamwave stuff, but in addition to that, there was the animated stuff from the 80s, and I guess the 90s too with Beast Wars, and then the Marvel comics. And you decided clean slate. We're going to start from scratch. None of that happened.
Yeah, and there were a couple of reasons for that. One was just that I didn't want to put out a series that made fans go, oh man, now I got to go backtrack and find all these old issues to figure out the continuity. Like I want a new Transformers number 1 or number 0 in the case of how we launched it, to be a thing that anybody can pick up, with passing familiarity of the Transformers or being a hardcore fan and read it and have the whole story starting in that issue, not be contingent on knowing everything that had come before. And then in more practical and sort of less kind of tawdry circumstances, Dreamwave did not treat a lot of the creators properly at the end. There were
Sure.
people that went unpaid. There were stories that went unfinished. And so some of it was it was legally tied up in them needing to make right with creators, or stuff that was unfinished in ways that we didn't even know where they were going to take it next. And so it was just kind of a mess. And so it was not going to be fair to anybody to either try to presume to pick up where they left off when we didn't know where things were headed, or, like I say, I just wanted it to be a thing that anybody could pick up and get in on the ground floor. And
from then to now, you've had essentially your own Transformer universe. You've kept that continuity going.
Yeah, we've done, like with anything, there are various stops and starts and things, but Transformers has been one that we've not tried to mess with relaunches or anything like that. It's just sort of been more of an extension. I mean, I guess you could argue that things like when we did All Hail Megatron,
sure,
it was almost tied more into at least the characterizations of the animated series than it was the previous Simon Furman comic. But we've tried to not scrap everything and do full reboots or anything like that with Transformers, and just move things forward. And, at times, like with any of the stuff that's been around, you tend to pick and choose what works and what doesn't, and what you pay attention to and what you sort of hope fades into the sidelines. So.
Right. Well, and so the early success you had with Transformers, pretty much. I mean, I remember at the time, it certainly in the minds of many fans, it was like, well, it seems like only a matter of time until you guys get G.I. Joe. Was it that much of an obvious presumption for you guys, or was that just fans sort of spitballing?
I think it was fans spitballing because there'd always been the Transformers G.I. Joe crossovers and tied in series and things like that, and since they were both Hasbro, but even then it wasn't a case of it's never been a thing where it's been handed to us. It's always been a case of, okay, well, if you guys had G.I. Joe 2, what would you do with that one? What would your take be? Would it be anything interesting? And so it's not an entire re-pitching in the same way that Transformers was, because by then, Hasbro knew who we were and what we could do, so we didn't have to prove ourselves as an unknown quantity like with Transformers. But it was still us wanting to make sure that we were the right partner for them, that we would be able to deliver what they wanted. And frankly, we wanted to make sure that it's a thing that we cared enough about to tackle. Like with any license, that's kind of the start of it all, is these things, even if you just do 4 or 5 issues and then you stop publishing that one, it doesn't go away. Like, it's not as easy as a quick series that disappears on you. you're married to these licenses for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And
Sure.
so if you don't like it, it really feels like work, it really feels like you're grinding it out. So with all of these things, G.I. Joe and Transformers and everything that we've done, you can tell who in the, what properties we like, because those are the ones we've taken on. And we've never really taken on big licenses for just financial reasons. It's always been stuff where somebody here has a passion for it and wants to pursue it. And then, the comics come out of that. But if there's no passion for it, then I think that really comes off to the fans. The fans see it as a cynical thing, and it reads that way. And so G.I. Joe was the same as Transformers, where we were very big fans of the property, really thought we could do something fun with it, and so, pursued it from there.
Now, insofar as G.I. Joe goes, this was the decision. You made the same decision at the time to start from the ground up. And as I recall at the time, that there was some question there, because unlike with Transformers, at least in comics, there had basically been one G.I. Joe quote unquote canon going from 1982 or whenever the book started through to,
Right again?
Is it?
Yeah, 1982.
82 to, and then, in 2001, Image started doing it. You know what's funny is Image's G.I. Joe #1. I'll never forget this. It came out September 12th, 2001. That linkage of it came out the day after 9/11, but they continued, the Larry Hama continuity, albeit with a different writer. So when you guys were tasked with doing your take on Joe, I mean, it was a much bolder decision to say we're cutting the cord and we're starting fresh. So I mean, what was it, the same thing where you're like, we don't want to have people dealing with too much baggage?
Well, it's funny because we sort of cheated on that one, or we hedged our bets at least. Like we cut the cord while still holding onto the cord. We launched the new G.I. Joe series, which was a new continuity with people like Chuck Dixon and then Larry doing the origin stuff.
Oh, that's
but
right.
Then not long after that, we decided to revisit the Marvel stuff and continue Real American Hero with Larry. But we then sort of picked up just where the Marvel stuff left off. Again, because we figured the Larry Hama fans they're kind of a singular fan base in that they want the Larry Hama G.I. Joe written by Larry Hama. So the whether it was Joe Casey or whoever else tackled it, that continuity, it didn't seem to resonate with the fans in the same way. So we thought, well, let's on that one, but let's pick up right where the Marvel series ended. If Marvel ended at 155, let's do 155 and a half as an introductory thing to catch people up, and then pick up from there. So it's sort of Larry Hama picking up where he left off. So in that way, we tried new and old continuities. And I'll admit, like, overall, the G.I. Joe programs that we've done, they haven't had the same degree of lasting success as the Transformers has. You could certainly look back over our G.I. Joe runs and see that we've tried a few different relaunches, different things, which I don't say to our detriment as much as just, some stuff works, some stuff doesn't. So you try other things. But with G.I. Joe, I really wanted to launch a Cobra series. And I wanted Cobra to be this dark espionage kind of book where if we did the Cobra in the Larry Hama series, it was maybe played a little bit more cartoony or stereotypically superhero-like.
Sure.
And so we thought, well, if we're doing a Cobra series, then it should be out of a darker, more serious G.I. Joe book. And then, like you say, we did G.I. Joe a number of years after 9/11 when the world sort of viewpoint of the American military is a different thing. And so it would have felt weird to just pick up where we left off without trying to do different things that more properly reflected, the world we were living in.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, and I got to tell you, I mean, the G.I. Joe, the Real American Hero title, which is now in up through 200 something or other, that's the only comic book that I still like. That's the only physical comic book I still buy.
Oh, nice.
I read plenty of your titles digitally, but almost just out of pure tradition, I want to keep buying that comic because I've been reading, Larry Hama's G.I. Joe since I was, knee high,
That's why that one was really important to us to keep the numbering rather than start with a new number one. We talked about doing Real American Hero #1 as a way to bring in new fans, but we thought, well, this book isn't really aimed to bring in new fans. We're picking up after 155 issues of continuity. Like, this is kind of the definition of not appealing to a brand new fan base as much as it is let's keep giving the established fan base what they want. And so that one, it felt right to keep the initial numbering.
So G.I. Joe, you mentioned that you've had maybe a lesser degree of success than Transformers. What do you attribute that to?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think with Transformers, there are massive Transformer fans who have really been happy with what we've done. The G.I. Joe fan base seems more split than that. There are some G.I. Joe fans that want, like I say, the Larry Hama stuff that maybe plays a little bit more like the cartoon they watched as a kid. There are some G.I. Joe fans that want it to be hard military, real world kind of stuff where G.I. Joe is fighting terrorists. There's a G.I. Joe fan base that wants it to feel more like a superhero book. And so we've done different titles that aim at all of those, but there's not really one established G.I. Joe fan base as much as there are almost factions that want different things out of those books. So, wow. And, I don't know. I don't know if the name G.I. Joe has an 80s Ronald Reagan era connotation to it in some circles. Like I really don't know how in other countries, if it's perceived differently than ours, just by the name being such a kind of 80s military sounding thing. Sure. I don't know if that has any bearing whatsoever, but these are all the kind of things that we kick around when we talk about what to do with G.I. Joe, how we should handle it, who the fan base is and where we want to go next. And, a lot of it is anecdotal information or a few opinions from retailers or fans or just what we think. But, that's why you try a thing and hope it works. And if it doesn't, then ultimately you hand a insane book to a guy like Tom Scioli and let him do a G.I. Joe and Transformers book that is like nothing people have ever seen before.
Well, and that's an ongoing team up book that you have. Is it an ongoing title or was it a miniseries?
Yeah, I mean I think issue 11 just wrapped, and there's more on the way, and so but it's one of those that I don't think we ever could have done in our first 5 years with Hasbro. Maybe I'm jumping too far ahead post G.I. Joe, but
no, it's fine.
It is one of those that I think after having nearly a decade of really showing Hasbro what we could do and really showing them that we knew how to bring different and interesting interpretations of their characters into comic form, it was a thing where I can't believe they okayed that book. It's every issue that comes out, I read that thing and I go, this is the nuttiest comic I've ever read. And yet it's a licensed book that is being approved by, many different people and divisions at Hasbro. And it's amazing that they have that faith and trust in us to let us do that. And that fans have been so welcoming to a thing that is like no other type of Transformers or G.I. Joe book they've read.
Well, yeah, and a couple weeks ago, the announcement came out that Hasbro has plans to do a shared cinematic universe with G.I. Joe and Mask, and gosh, I think Visionaries is in there. A real melting pot. And I'm thinking, well, what about Transformers? How are we not pairing G.I. Joe and Transformers on the big screen? Because that seems like the most obvious thing. And I know there's probably company licensing issues. Exactly. But it seems like, well, that's the thing that, that's like Batman versus Superman where it's happening. And you're like, well, what took you so long?
Yeah. And I think a lot of what you see in Hollywood now with anybody that has any kind of franchise is everybody trying to do the Marvel thing.
The Marvel thing.
Yeah, so, once Hasbro establishes G.I. Joe in a proper way in cinema and brings in Mask or whoever else, and then the Transformers are well set in whatever form they are, who knows if once Michael Bay steps aside, if the movies reboot. I think there's always a plan in people's heads, whether it comes to fruition or not, to combine those in some way. When Spider-Man is now allowed to show up in the Marvel movies, all of those things end up overlapping once you establish them as their own thing and then bring them together. So
yeah, all bets are up.
That it's a much easier thing to do in comics. So I look forward to future opportunities of doing anything along those lines in comics.
Well, sure. I mean, and I mean, you mentioned this how Hasbro has been a lot more open to different ideas from you. And I think that's a reflection of the confidence they have in the product you've been turning out. And I mean, worth pointing out, you've got the My Little Pony license too. And there is a passionate My Little Pony fan base that I had no idea existed.
We knew there was a fan base for the book. We didn't know that there were the different fan bases to the same degree that it's proven out. We had certain expectations for that book when we were launching it, and then it launched to like 100,000 sales more than we expected. So it's great that it's a book that appeals to, like, I have a 9-year-old or 10-year-old daughter now, and she loves it. And I love that there are 25-year-old fans that love the book with the same sort of fervor. And I love that there's older fans and there's, people that don't read other comics, and that it's kind of like when I was a kid. Avengers wasn't a book that was aimed at kids or aimed at adults. It was just a fun comic that spoke to different readers at different age groups. And I think Ponies is one that really does that. There's a lot of in-jokes that work for people that get older pop culture references, but there's a lot of good stories about teamwork and friendship and everything that work for younger kids. And there's fun storytelling and art that works for both of them. So it's great when there's the kind of thing that really does reach across so many different audiences like that one does.
Well, and along those lines, you have the Gem and the Holograms comic, which that's another reinvention. That's not really beholden to sort of the 1980s, the original, the animated version.
Right.
So that's a situation which I wanted to pick your brain about, because I think this is interesting. Your comic came out, and there was there's been a fair amount of positive reaction to it. And then, this past year, a film adaptation came out, which, it's fair to say that the reaction was less positive. One might say was extremely less positive. Now, in a situation like that, does that affect? Is there like a ripple outward effect where a movie sort of flopping as badly as that, does that affect your plans in any way, or do you just kind of keep your head down and keep doing what you're doing?
Yeah, it doesn't affect our plans as much as it can sometimes affect the audience's attention on a book. And again, some of this is just anecdotal from a few retailers, but I did hear some reports that, like, when the first trailers came out, there were fans that canceled their book and everything. And it was kind of like, well,
is that right?
Yeah. And it was like, well, aren't people savvy enough now to know that the comic version and the movie versions are often wildly different? And so, especially if you like what's already going on in the comic, and whether you like the movie or what their take is or not, like, we're giving you the version that you already like. So maybe it feels like then you sort of become more territorial about the version that you like, kind of like the Transformers fans to some degree. Those movies are obviously massive global hits, but they're the hardcore Transformer fans that want the Transformers to look and feel like the version they've grown up with that didn't like the movie. And so they almost doubled down in their interest in the comic because they gave them that version. And so with Gem, I felt like it should have had the same reaction. Like, all right, well, the film version obviously didn't pay attention to what the fans of the property wanted, but the comic is doing just that. And so
they should be backing you guys.
Yeah, and I think they are. And the numbers are certainly really nice and strong in that book. And we got a great write-up even in the New Yorker at the end of last year, which is great that the New Yorker paid attention to the comic in that way. But it always helps to have a movie that doesn't get some people to raise their eyebrows when you mention the title.
You'd rather the movie do well than not do well.
It benefits everybody when that happens. Yeah. But maybe next time, though, that leads studios or filmmakers or whoever to go, maybe we should rely more on the source material, because this seems to be what people are really taken by. So,
yeah, well, and as it pertains to Gem, I'm not an authority on the original series, except for, I like the song. I have to admit, the theme song is on shuffle on my iPod. That's my shameful secret that I'm broadcasting to the entire world. But I do remember when the trailer dropped and just seeing the reaction from people who would have grown up with it and had that visceral, like, well, this is nothing like the thing that I know. And I found that fascinating only in the sense that, like you said, we're at a point now this far into the age of adaptations, cross-property adaptations, where things are so close to the source material that there's less excuse now to really stray too far afield from, whatever it was that made it unique.
That said, I completely get that movies need to do different things and serve different masters and, appeal to a much wider audience than comics do. So I get the changes being made on these things. And for all of the grousing about Michael Bay at the start, like nobody could argue that what he's done hasn't been just a colossal global success, whether the hardcore fans like it or not. You know, there's no argument in the numbers that those movies have consistently put up. But that does kind of also speak to one of the ongoing challenges of doing licensed books, in that you have so many different types of fans that you try to satisfy. And obviously there's no way you're going to make everybody happy, but there are the fans that grew up on the Transformers cartoon. There are fans that love the comic. There are fans that love Generation 2. There are the fans, like you say, in the 90s that love Beast Wars. And so how do you do a Transformers anything that is going to appeal to a large number of those people when they each have very different expectations of what that Transformers, movie or comic should be? So that's really kind of the fun of doing these things, is let's figure out what's going to work, or what we think is going to work to the greatest degree possible. But, you never quite know until it's out there in the world, and then you find out what resonates and what doesn't.
Well, you just set up the perfect segue for me. I mean, when we talk about invested fan bases that are divided and have their own views of how things should be, you guys are home of Star Trek.
Yes.
Of
which there are many fan bases.
Well, that's exactly right. And now I think what's fascinating to me is I've encountered people who do not like the reboot. They don't like the J.J. Abrams spearheaded reboot, but they like the IDW comics that are set within the realm of that reboot.
Oh, is that right? That's funny.
So, I mean, I think that says something about the work you're doing. Now you have the ongoing Star Trek series, which is set in the rebooted universe, but you also keep your feet in various other, the classic, I guess we'd call it the prime Star Trek universe. You still have titles set in that. So, I mean, how do you balance that? Because I was just reading an article a few weeks ago about how even within, I mean, just because of the Star Trek rights sort of being split between CBS and Paramount, there's sort of internecine, sniping there. So you guys have a bit of a challenge as far as how you balance this property.
Well, bigger challenge than that is all the people that go, give me Voyager, give me DS9, give me and it's like, well, we can't.
And one person, me,
one
person.
Was that Voyager?
I'm saying Enterprise. I want the Enterprise comic. I'm literally the only person who stands up for that show.
Yeah, you might be. No, I've actually gotten a few Enterprise requests too, but Enterprise and Voyager are certainly going to be less
lower down.
And, yeah, I mean, they're never going to appeal to the same degree of fans as original series or Next Gen, because there were just such bigger fan bases to begin with on those things. So with the movie stuff, it was funny where we're sort of stopping our original series stuff, the stuff based on the 60s show, and doing more stuff that's based on the movie, but then that's likely going to alienate some of those old fans that hated the J.J. Abrams verse. So again, yeah, you never quite know how stuff's going to go over to that degree. And it's funny that you would say that there are people you've heard that don't like the movies but do like the comics. I haven't heard that one before. Maybe that just means they hate Chris Pine's voice, or they hate the frequent use of the Beastie Boys, or whatever the case may be in the movies. But I'm glad they like ours.
Well, and I mean, this is the thing that's so interesting to me, is because of, I mean, I used to read DC, like back when DC had the Star Trek license, and I don't know, I mean, it was Mike Carlin was writing it, and I think Mike Barr wrote it in the beginning, and they were, if you remember, that title was coming out. This was like original series Star Trek, but it was at the time of the movies, like the original movies. Oh,
I remember. Yeah, I mean, I remember they. In fact, it started post movie 3.
I think it started just before the third one came out.
Okay, yeah, because then they did do the adaptation. Yeah,
they did Search for Spock.
Going to appeal to 5% of the people listening, probably going back this long to talk about DC's mid-'80s Star Trek comics. But yeah, I thought they were really well done.
But when you think about it, I mean, the problem that they had was that they were doing kind of similar to what Marvel did with Star Wars, where they're telling these stories in between the movies.
Yeah.
And then they have to quickly reset
right.
Yeah, because, and so it's kind of, it was this weird thing where you have, I mean, gosh, I'd have to it's like Spock is like the captain of this other ship, and there's this whole thing, and then they have to quickly lead up to the voyage home, which obviously Spock is not the captain of a ship in, and now you guys, your Star Trek comic is doing the same thing. You're telling stories in between these movies, but there's this greater interconnectivity with what the movie people are doing. And I mean, I don't even want to ask, like, is it canon, quote unquote, because that's such a loaded question. But
see, it's fine with me if you ask on that one, because we've had the guys that worked on the movie, involved on the comics from the start. So they've been suggesting stories and tweaking things and making sure that it does tie in with the different movies. So now that the third movie is going to be slightly different in that regard, there may be a little bit of catch up, or changing course or something, or just telling a few stories that bridge the gap a bit. But that's also, all part of the fun of doing these things, is trying to make it work until it doesn't, and then you make it work again. And, X-Files is sort of the same scenario, where we've been doing these things with Chris Carter, telling ostensibly, what we called season 10.
Yeah.
But then now he's doing the new series, which is very different from a full season 10. So there's likely to be little bits of catch up and make up and all of that. But, there's always fans who are going to see the filmed thing. Whatever's filmed is somehow more canon, if that's a possible descriptor.
Right.
It's more legitimate in their eyes because it's bigger budget, or it's the actors, or it's it's moving pictures, all of that. And then the comics, the way people consider canon sort of scales on down from there. Like, was Joss Whedon involved in the Angel comics? Okay, those are canon. And then, was
Right.
Bob Orsi involved in Star Trek? Okay, that's more canon than the stuff where he wasn't. And so, I don't know. The canon argument or discussion to me is always a funny one, because I don't care. Like, I consider canon, and I don't mean I don't care about the argument, but I mean, for me, I don't care about something being canon if I don't like it. Like, if I don't like it, it's not canon. If I like
Sure.
it, that fits into my particular canon.
Well, and I totally agree with that, but I do think it's very interesting how the canon argument, above and beyond comics and licensed material, but just how valuable that notion of canon has become. And I think, just using Star Trek as an example, the fact that they didn't do the Battlestar Galactica route, where it's like big red reboot button, everything starts fresh. They said, no, this is a reboot, but everything is still quote unquote happened, and here it is. It's safe and sound over there, while we're doing this over here. I mean, that to me is kind of a fascinating indication of I don't know, fan ownership, or the ownership that fans feel, whether rightly or wrongly, with these long running properties.
Yeah, and it was a nice bit of threading that particular needle, like doing something new and you have to. Like, there's no way you're going to be able to trot out 80-year-old William Shatner, and, poor Leonard Nimoy is no longer even able to be trotted out. So you got to do new things.
Yeah.
But you also don't want to scrap 50 years of what the fans love. So I thought they did a nice job of finding a way to do that.
I agree.
That was the challenge Star Wars faced when Star Wars had this extended universe, where all the novels that were years ago thought of, the Timothy Zahn stuff, was, okay, these are official Lucas approved. Like, when we read those, it was like, we're getting Star Wars 7, 8, and 9 in these novels.
This is it. Yeah.
Said, he anointed these. These are real. These are legit. But then when the next movie comes along, it's like, no, they weren't. So
yeah, and people are pissed about it. It's
yeah.
Now, I'm not somebody who necessarily, I didn't follow we're talking of Star Wars, that expanded universe to any great degree, not out of lack of interest, but just lack of A, money, and B, time. But I'm certainly sympathetic to people who feel like, oh my gosh, 25 years or however long this stuff lasted has just been sort of kicked to the curb for the quote unquote real version.
It's funny. Maybe I'm on both sides as a fan of all of this pop culture, and also somebody working on these types of things. But like, there's just really no way to forever include everything. And I know somebody's going to be offended by cutting this out, but DC married Lois and Superman, whenever that was in the 80s, and Spider-Man and Mary Jane got married. And it was like, well, that sort of changes everything this character is about. So a generation later, when there's new 15-year-olds or 25-year-olds that were hoping to pick up Spider-Man.
Yeah.
This doesn't speak to them in the same way. So we got to go erase that. And I think it all, just like everything, it becomes all in the telling. Like, is there a good way to tell that story, or is there you bring in Mephisto and then take another one? So it's all in like how masterfully you sort of redo and update the story, but also not just completely scrap every bit of everything that fans like, because that does get to become a delicate walk.
Well, and I think the beauty of all of these universes, pick your universe, is you can find the one you like and have that, and that's, you know what I mean, and there's plenty for everybody.
Yeah, that's the way I see it. Is there's been a lot of bad things in comics. There was teenage Tony Stark when Iron Man died years ago, and then he became a teenager, and it was just like, oh, this is awful. But then you learn as a comic fan, you're like, oh, if I don't like this, just wait it out. If I don't like, if you don't like this character being recast as Thor or Captain America, well,
just give it time.
The other guy's coming back at some point. Yeah, so that's sort of what comics does. It resets, and there's certainly no shortage of media, whether it's comics or anything. If you need to take a break for a while and then check back in years later and see how it's doing and see if it's more like you like. So anyway,
well, and to that point, I mean, I'm sitting here, and right next to me on my nightstand is the IDW published collection of the Stan Lee Spider-Man newspaper strips.
Yeah, I love those.
Which, I mean, these are gorgeous collections, and I really want to, if anybody who's listening to this show, you might not even be aware that there is a Spider-Man newspaper strip, which I think it's amazing how long the strip has been around, and yet there's this chunk of comic fandom that has no idea they exist. Check these out. These are Stan Lee written. John Romita drew them, and you talk about having the version that you like. I mean, this is a Spider-Man universe, quote unquote, that's set apart from the one in the regular comics, and yet it's as primally Spider-Man as anything else I've ever read. So I'm having an absolute blast going through these and rereading them from when I was a kid.
Well, and that was the strip that then, not to get too arcane on that stuff, but that was what then led the comic book Spider-Man to getting married, because Stan was going to be marrying Peter and Mary Jane in the newspaper strip. So then the comic decided to reflect that, because that newspaper strip was getting all the attention. So, with all this stuff, you try to err on the side of telling good stories and not alienating fans. And I realize it's impossible. So you try your best, and, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I'd say in most cases, and, to whatever degree we can control that on our end, we try to err on the side of, doing right by fans and doing right by the property, and, just also moving things forward. Not to segue again into something different, but like, this is the thing that we're challenged with bringing back this book, ROM.
Yes, thank you. You did my job for me. Thank you.
Well, it's funny because it's one of those, like, I've been a giant fan of that stuff when I was a kid. Like, it's one that mattered to me way more than it probably should have for what it was. But I really loved the thing. And so in the 10 years I've been talking to Hasbro, I've been trying to bring that one back. And so now that we're able to bring it back, then it becomes, all right, well, there's a certain segment like me that loved it when they were kids, but there's a lot more people out there that have no idea what ROM is, other than maybe they've heard me or other people talk about it, or they've seen people on Tumblr draw this robot, or it's been alluded to in Marvel Comics. But
well, let's talk about this real briefly then, because I think people should get a little bit of context, because I think ROM is a deep dive even for people who are listening to this show.
Right.
And it's funny because actually the first time that you and I interacted online was in reference to ROM, because I had custom bound my collection of ROM comic books, and I put them into 3 volumes, and you had asked me where I did that, and that was kind of the first time I talked to you. So kind of interesting piece of trivia for those of you keeping track.
And you led me to the place that did it then, yeah?
Did you do it the place in Waco?
God, I don't even remember where they're based, but they did a wonderful job anyway.
There you go. So somehow
all the ROM stuff. So talking to Hasbro for years trying to do it, and it was forever tied up and not able to be done. And so then, like, I got so not frustrated, but just sort of like threw up my hands of like, well, I'm never going to get reprints of the ROM stuff, so I'm going to go do a bound collection now. And I think that's when we chatted about, where to get it done. But that was sort of the driving point. Was I'd almost given up on trying to bring Rom back to comics, and so I thought, well, I'll get nice bound editions at least on my bookshelf.
Now, I mean, the fascinating thing though, Chris, is that unlike a lot of these other properties that we're talking about, Rom, nobody looks back fondly at the universe of Rom action figures.
Oh God, no!
Right? Because the
terrible.
toy itself was, it was a pretty ugly looking thing that looked nothing like.
Going for it was like one of the very first LED powered toys. So you had like, pen light eyes and these other little pen lights that lit up on various parts of his body or the weapons, but otherwise there's no articulation. Like it's a mess.
It really is. So, and it was Parker Brothers before they were purchased by Hasbro, if I'm not mistaken. And so Bill Mantlo at Marvel spearheaded the comic, and basically, I mean, he spun straw into gold. Really, I mean, I don't think that's an exaggeration. Based on not only what he did, but how he was able to keep this property alive in the comics far past the toy coming and going. It lasted something like 75 issues, I believe.
75 and 4 annuals.
4 annuals, and by the way, this was a part of the Marvel universe. He was plugged in to the extent that if you were like me, for example, I mean, I grew up at around the time the Rom comics were published. I had no idea it was a toy. I just assumed he was another Marvel character.
Yeah, I think that's what, speaking earlier about bad licensed comics back then, this should have been a bad licensed comic.
Yeah.
The toy was terrible. Nothing ever came of it. And there was really no other toys even with it. It was just the one ROM toy that, nobody liked. So the comic should have been like the next Human Fly, which is another licensing that they did.
Right.
That sort of came and went quickly, although I kind of love that one too. But ROM shouldn't have been the good comic it was. They should have just put subpar talent on the thing and let it sort of drift along the sidelines. But at least the first 4 years of the thing really played more like, I don't know, like a paranoid 70s movie or almost like a 50s science fiction movie, much more than a superhero comic, because there was real stakes to it. Characters got killed and didn't come back, and there were, the dire wraiths who were the bad guys had taken over real characters, and so you didn't know who to trust, and it was, I don't know, it really spoke to me as a kid in ways that just the bigger superhero stuff, which all felt kind of the same, never did.
Sure. Well, and the other thing is that ROM ended. I mean, the story ended and the book ended, and I remember, gosh, this must have been like 85, I want to say, something like that, right, when the original title ended.
Yeah.
And I was at like a Montgomery Ward. Remember Montgomery Ward?
I do.
And they had comics, and they had the final issue of ROM. And I was probably all of 6 years old, and I was like, wait a minute, comics end? Like, this is a thing that happened? I had no idea you could do that. So
it ends, and dude gets cracked out of his armor, with the love of his life, and they're basically rebuilding his home planet together. And then we signed to do ROM, and people go, well, you can pick up where it left off? I'm like, you got his happy ending. The only way to pick up where it left off is to spoil that happy ending and put him through terrible things. So I would hate to do that.
Okay. So this is interesting. Now you are co-writing the ROM title, the rebooted
with
ROM.
Gage, yes.
With Christos Gage, who's a terrific writer, and so this is my question now. So we've already gotten a great version of ROM. How do we tell the same story in a new way, or how do we tell a similar story while not even attempting to top that? What's your approach to this property that you love so much?
It's funny, that was a long conversation. I mean, it's been a conversation long before we ever had a chance to publish it, because it was like, well, if we ever got this, what would we do? And so I want to talk about our plans, because we have big plans that I think people won't necessarily see coming, but I don't want to say too much about it, because I want it to be a surprise to them. But it's kind of, when we first signed to do it, there was a lot of people who were really happy about it. And then there was a lot of people who said, well, this is terrible, because without Marvel, if Marvel's not doing it, it's going to suck. It needs the Marvel universe. It needs the other Space Knights that Marvel created. It needs all of those things. to be any good, which to me is just a complete challenge. Like, all right, well, you think this thing's going to fall flat because we have nothing but Rom and the dire race. Let me figure out a lot of different ways that you are going to be proven wrong. And so it's been fun to talk with Christos and some other people here too about what we want to do and where we're going to take it and how to make this into something that doesn't just feel like a character minus its universe, which is what I think some people are, at least online, afraid of. You know, they're afraid it's going to be they're afraid it's going to be the toy. It's going to be the silver thing that doesn't have all the cool stuff around it, which is what Marvel admittedly gave it. But there are other ways to do that without having the X-Men or, you know, some of the other things that Marvel retains ownership of.
And the beauty of it is that version is there forever. He'll live on in back issues if that's the version that you want. But this is a chance to do something new with the same character.
Yeah, and so there was a lot of talking and planning and figuring out. You know, Christos and I are big fans of this stuff. So for us, like, to make it a Rom comic, it needs to have a lot of the same elements that Rom had, even if it doesn't have, you know, the Marvel Universe. For Hasbro, it needs to be something beyond that, because not only do we not want to tread ground that's been covered before, but it also needs to be a thing that can work in 2016 and not just feel like a cover album, you know? Like, we don't want this to just feel like we are taking somebody else's greatest hits and then replaying them. We are doing something different and new. So there's a constant dialogue of, well, how new and different can we make it without alienating the old fans, but also making it feel like something new and interesting to them. So that's been a lot of fun to just figure out what is that approach and what's going to work. And I thought we were like, okay, we got this. We know what we're going to do. Fans are, you know, the old fans are going to still dig it. The new fans are going to like it. If you don't know what the hell Rom is, you're still going to be intrigued by it. And then we put out the first piece of art, which is everything people would expect from the previous version of Rom. We didn't do any crazy Gundam style, you know, modern updates. But we gave him fingers. You know, he had the stupid toy back in the day. They couldn't do articulated fingers because they could barely make a molded hand shaped like a mitten. And so the comic followed suit. The comic had mitten hands.
Right.
That struck me as silly. Like, the poor guy is trapped in his armor forever. He didn't have hands, you know. So, well, now let's at least give him fingers. Let's update things to that degree. It's a minor but very functional and useful change, and nobody could possibly complain about this, right?
Wrong.
Oh my God. I got the usual accusations of killing people's childhood. We got accusations that we don't understand the property at all, that we have destroyed it, that there's no reason to look at it. And I'm like, over fingers? Like, oh man.
It's you know, it's surprising, but it's not surprising.
It was kind of welcoming, honestly. It was like, hey, we have our organic web shooters now. We have the thing that that fans will be up in arms about, and they're up in arms about it because they care about the character. So I don't agree with him that giving him fingers means we don't understand the character, but I like that they have enough passion about the thing to have an opinion about it. Like, the worst thing we could do is put out something and people go, I don't know. What else is there? You know, so the fact that they're at least interested to see if we you know, completely pooch the thing is at least they'll check out the free comic. We're giving it to everybody for free. So if you don't like the fingers, at least you can just pick it up. It won't cost you a dime. And then hopefully you see something there that brings you back for more.
Now, so the ROM will debut as part of your free comic book day offering for this year.
Yeah, it's our big gold level sponsorship title. So, which means it's one that will be seen by the most people. Although we kind of missed an opportunity to not make it our silver level because, you know, he's a big silver
right.
robot and all. But yeah, it's the gold level one, so it should be everywhere on Free Comic Book Day. I can't wait. We're just going through the final tweaks of the issue 0 today, in fact, and so locking down the very first issue of ROM in 30-some years to.
And this is an ongoing series.
Yes, starting in July, it'll be an ongoing.
Now, at the same time your ROM acquisition was announced, there was also the announcement of Micronauts, which is kind of linked to ROM in the same way that G.I. Joe is linked to Transformers in a lot of people's psyches. Is there anything you can tell us about your plans for Micronauts?
Yeah, although, you know, it's funny, like, how did ROM and Micronauts never interact back in the day?
Yeah, that's an odd one.
The same writer wrote both books, and yet there was no crossovers or anything. But yeah, so we're launching Micronauts in April, and so I think there will be a way to do some things that Marvel didn't do in those two books. Like when I say that they didn't meet before, there's a much stronger chance that they will meet now. So there's
wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
right. Yeah, that was very subtle, wasn't it? But
now
yeah,
this
Cullen
is. I mean,
Bunn's
this is.
launching that one.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Cullen Bunn and David Baldeon are launching that one, and it's a blast so far. I love what they've done so far, so I can't wait to see that one get back out into the world too.
Now, unlike ROM, Micronauts is something that there was an attempt to do it in the middle there. I think that was also Devil's Due, actually.
Right.
Who did G.I. Joe. And they ran into the problem of several of the characters are still with Marvel. And I mean, how without, I mean, obviously I'm sure you can't give away anything, but I'm sure that's something you've given thought to as far as how to make it feel like classic, quote unquote, Micronauts while having to work around sort of the characters you can't use.
Yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of fans that are familiar with the stuff know, the stuff that Marvel created, like rightfully so, are stuff that they own. So the characters, primarily it's the characters Bug, Marionette, and Commander Ron, and the last two were the humans that were in the book. So we have access to basically every Micronaut that was a toy, and there's a ton of them. We can't use, Bug, Marionette, and Commander Ron, but we'll have a female character called Puppet and a Micronaut called Insect. And no, I'm just kidding. We'll stay away from those characters entirely. But,
you had me going there. I was like, oh, okay, that's cool.
We'll leave that stuff in the Marvel universe, and maybe who knows down the line. I mean, crossovers are always a thing. Maybe there's a way that they can all meet up at some point. But on that one, I'm certainly not worried. There are, like I say, dozens upon dozens of toys that can be used, and so there's a full big universe that we can build there.
Now, you mentioned crossover, and I see that we're running out of time, so I want to make sure I mention this. A few weeks ago, my kids, I read comics to them before they go to bed, and a few weeks ago, I got to read to them the story of when Captain James T. Kirk met Colonel George Taylor, and I'm talking your Star Trek Planet of the Apes crossover that you co-published with Boom Studios, and the look of just wonderment in my kids' eyes as they saw Kirk and Taylor going at it, because being my kids, they've been heavily exposed to Star Trek and Planet of the Apes. Therefore, they will get picked on very shortly in the near future, I fully expect.
That is to me just proper parenting right there.
It's Planet of the Apes is my all-time favorite movie. So as soon as they were old enough to recognize it and find it terrifying, that's when I started showing it to them. But I love the fact that you guys you took a concept that anybody would have been like, well, that's just ridiculous. Why would we do that? And you said, let's just write the hell out of this and do something amazing. And I have to give props to Scott Tipton who wrote that. It was a fantastic series.
It really worked well. And the nice thing about it is, as Scott says, when you ask him about it, the story doesn't make sense at all, except for one tiny little sliver of time where he actually found the way that these two properties could properly interact without it being too contrived. So, yeah, I thought they did a great job with it. As far as crossovers go, I thought that one and then the Star Trek Green Lantern book that we did this past year worked really well because they didn't feel forced. And, sometimes crossovers are – a lot of them follow the same kind of tone where they've never met, they meet, they fight, they get along, they team up against the big threat, and so these both felt more organic than that to me, and so they felt like the kind of thing that gives fans what they want to see, the character moments and meetups that they would like, but they don't do it in too contrived a way.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's one of those things where from the outside looking in, obviously it's preposterous. And
completely, yeah.
And so it's kind of like, okay, well, there's the good version of this preposterous story and there's the bad version of this preposterous story. So for both of those series, the Green Lantern crossover and the Planet of the Apes one, they were just a blast. They were so much fun. And I love the fact that, without spoiling it, the end of the Planet of the Apes crossover very neatly dovetails into the third Apes movie, to the point where my kids are like, oh, so that's how they ended up back in time? Like, like it's like your story that you guys published filled in like a piece of missing information for them that suddenly now it all makes sense.
Yeah, and see, those kind of things are the fun challenges because you're serving a lot of masters when you do those kinds of crossovers. Boom holds the rights to Planet of the Apes, and then Fox owns Planet of the Apes, and then there's Star Trek with CBS and Paramount, and then so there's a lot of different sides that all need to be made happy and be made convinced that these stories make sense. So it's a really fun challenge to sit down and try to figure out how can we do that? What can we do with these things that actually make them make enough sense to want to exist?
So that particular crossover, who did that originate with?
God, it's always so hard to know in these things. Either we reached out to Boom or Boom reached out to us, but we talked to various people about different crossovers at times, and so I don't remember the gestation of it. It might have even been the Tipton saying, "Hey, let us do these two. These are both our two favorite movies or properties. We would love to, combine them together."
So, I mean, how do you, like, when you take that to the studio, are they kind of like, seriously?
They usually say, "We don't see a reason for this to exist. Give us one." And then if we give them a good pitch and in their minds, then they can reconcile that story and those characters actually interacting, then it happens.
Well, and real briefly before I let you go, I wanted to bring up the Back to the Future comic that you guys do, which is fantastic. And it was originally meant to be a miniseries. It's I believe it's now going to be an ongoing.
Correct.
So now, how did you guys end up doing this? I mean, this is one of these things where I think the only time there's been a Back to the Future comic was a tie-in to the animated show that I think Harvey did back in the 90s. So this is one of those things where it's like, how has there never been a Back to the Future comic?
It was very similar to Ghostbusters in that the Ghostbusters comics before, that people like now did, they were tied into the real Ghostbusters animated show.
That's right.
And so once we convinced, I don't know, it takes a lot less convincing now than like when we first, had to peddle our wares to Hasbro and show them why we were the right ones to do Transformers. Now, after a good decade of doing so many big license books and treating them well and getting great fan response, now it's much easier when we reach out to people and say, "Hey, we would like to do that same thing for your property." So once we had Ghostbusters, which, there aren't direct likeness rights. We don't have Bill Murray or Dan Aykroyd's faces. So you take a different tactic with it. And so once we could show the studio, we would take that same kind of approach with Back to the Future, do something that's fun, that doesn't alienate the people that like the animated series, but is, certainly more movie driven. And then adding to that, getting Bob Gale involved, because Back to the Future is one where it's the creator's property. It's not, the studio owns it, but it's the creator who made that thing what it is. So without Bob Gale, it has a lot less appeal. And so we thought, well, if we can do this with Bob Gale, then by all means, let's go after it and see if we can make it happen.
And that book has been a blast. And I mean, Back to the Future, Ghostbusters, G.I. Joe, Gem and the Holograms, Star Trek, Transformers, the list goes on. And I didn't even get to pick your brain about Ninja Turtles and Jurassic Park, which I enjoyed the titles you published of those. But unfortunately, we are just about out of time. So, Chris, first of all, thanks so much for coming and chatting with us.
Oh, man, real pleasure.
IDW is the home of Nostalgia Theater. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're not checking out IDW comics, although I'm guessing the inverse is more likely true than
we always hope so.
But if you're not checking it out, do check out the books that they're publishing. I can virtually assure you that if you're liking what we're doing here on this show, then they're publishing stuff that you will like also. Chris, where can people find you online if they want to reach out to you?
I'm on Twitter, I'm on Tumblr, I'm on Instagram. I think most of them are Chris_Ryall, which is Ryall. And then IDW site, will show you everything that we do here, and Facebook or whatever, I'm also there. So any number of those places, I welcome any kind of feedback. If there's other properties you think we should be doing that we're not, I always like hearing from people about those, and sometimes those lead to things that we're now doing. So, one thing that I really love about the job that I certainly had more time for before than the last few years is the fan, the direct fan interaction. So I love the social media aspect of that, letting me talk right to people and hearing from them what they like and what they don't like, and if they hate Rom's hands, and all of that. So,
well, there we go. And thank you so much, Chris, for joining us on the show. And hopefully we look forward to having you back.
I'd love to. Yeah. Thank you.
Big thanks to Chris for joining me. And again, IDW Publishing is where it's at when it comes to nostalgia theater in the comics. And worth pointing out, since the time that I talked to him and the time that you were listening to this, they've announced that they're also rebooting Mask. So if you remember the 1980s toy line / TV series Mask, which was made by Kenner, I believe it's owned by Hasbro now, that's going to be an IDW comic as well. So the nostalgia theater hits keep coming from IDW Publishing, and I'm very confident that we'll have Chris back on to talk up some of the new stuff that they have coming up. And we're just a few days away from Free Comic Book Day, where you will be able to pick up the very first comic of ROM in decades. So please make that happen. As you heard, that's a labor of love for him, and I know I'm looking forward to checking it out, and I'm sure you will be too. Real quick, before we sign off, I wanted to share some reviews that we've gotten on iTunes, and this is something I've been meaning to do for a couple episodes now, but just time has sort of gotten away from us. Time has been slipping away, and this goes back to the past couple months, so I wanted to share these reviews. So this is from Eric Sean, who said, just finished listening to Zaki Hassan's informative and entertaining interview with First Blood novelist and Rambo creator David Morrell, and that was a couple episodes ago. I was particularly fascinated to learn what all inspired Morrell to write the original novel and who he had in mind when first envisioning John Rambo. Highly recommend to fans of the Rambo films or pop culture geeks in general. And that's from Eric, so thank you for that. And this is from Derek Bergen, who wrote, tremendous podcast. What a fantastic start to a podcast, and reminded me a lot of I Was There Too, another podcast worth going out of your way to listen to. And I actually, I started listening to that on the recommendation of my movie film co-host, Brian Hall, and it is a fantastic listen. Wonderful stories on G.I. Joe with writer Buzz Dixon, and an unbelievably detailed look at the history of Rambo with author David Morrell is what drove me to the podcast, and I'll be sticking around for as long as they have me. The time flies by in the interviews and always leaves you wanting more. Keep up the great work. Thank you for that, Derek. And here we have one from NamTab29, titled Unexplored Corners of Geek Culture. Great show. Host Zaki Hassan manages to find interesting, yet rarely interviewed luminaries from geek culture, which ends up making for very compelling podcasts. The show's guests have lots of great stories, the kind of stuff you just would never otherwise have a chance to learn. Looking forward to future episodes. And then lastly here, this is from Neary's Tower, who says, fantastic for interviews. Super engaging podcast with fantastic interviews led by an excellent host. I haven't even read the Rambo novel, but hearing all of the insight and anecdotes Zaki pulled out of its author were endlessly interesting. Geeks, fanboys, and those interested in the nuances of entertainment all will find something to enjoy here. Keep up the good work, Zaki. Well, thank you for that, Neary's Tower. I gotta say, this is fantastic. I'm gonna, whenever I feel down on myself, I'm gonna pull up my iTunes reviews and just kind of pat myself on the back and walk a little taller, stand a little straighter. This is fantastic. So I've got another fun episode lined up for just 2 weeks from now. I'm not going to tell you who's on it or what we're talking about, but I think you'll dig it. And if you don't like it, you'll make me angry. There's a hint. Is that a hint? I guess it's a hint. I guess you'll find out in 2 weeks if your hint lined up with what it actually is. But regardless, this has been Nostalgia Theater, and again, you heard some of these reviews. Please go to iTunes, please go to Stitcher Radio, go to TuneIn Radio, wherever you find podcasts. Leave us a review, leave us a star rating. You can also email me, moviefilmpodcast@gmail.com. That's our sort of umbrella email address for both of the shows. And of course, you can find me on Twitter at Zaki's Corner. That's ZAKI's Corner. That's also my website. Just add a .com to that. My movie reviews go up regularly at Huffington Post, as does this show. And with that, I hope you will join me again in just a couple weeks. Thanks for listening.